Thank you very much. And when people call me doctor or professor, they're just speaking kind of euphemistically. I'm not either one of those. I did teach high school for a little while, but I just want to first off start by saying how incredibly honored I am that you folks wanted to hear what I have to say. You've invited me to talk about the one thing that I enjoy most talking about, which is my experience with this disease, because it's changed my life. And it began in 2015. And I would have to say these last years until now have been some of the richest years of my own life because of the way this thing has unfolded for me. Let me share my screen to get started here. There we go. Okay, let me just, right. Okay, a couple of disclosures at the beginning. I'm not a doctor. I'm not even a researcher. I have no medical training. And also I am not cured. I am doing really, really well, but it'll catch up with me in the end if things stay on track. Alzheimer's disease is only finally diagnosed in the autopsy. And I'm kind of not in a hurry to get there. But what they tell me is that I have Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to discuss my personal experiences, but I'm also going to discuss the research that I found that appears to explain what has happened to me. And if I say something that's not right, Dr. Washington's job is to, in American football, we say throw a flag on the play. So he's going to correct anything that I might say incorrectly. But in the last previous presentations where he's been with me, he hasn't had anything to say other than positive things. I just want to start by saying this whole thing began with me in the year 2013. In that year, I was having trouble with my balance, and I was worried that I might have a brain tumor because my grandfather had a big brain tumor and caused him a lot of problems with his balance. So I went to a neurologist, a local neurologist, and he did an MRI of my brain, and they couldn't find anything wrong. And so the next question was, well, if it's not in his brain, then it must be in the vestibular. And what happens in your ear gives you balance, but it tells your brain which way's up, which way's down, what your head is doing. And so they sent me for some tests on my vestibular system, but they all came back just fine. Now, what didn't register at the time, though, is if there's nothing wrong with your vestibular system, then there's something wrong with your brain and you're having trouble with balance. So that was 2013. They taught me some kind of exercises I could do called habituation exercises that helped me with my balance problems. And that worked out very well. But then in 2014, late 2014, I started to have some strange problems. We were in Hawaii at the end of the year because my son was getting married there. And we were very busy getting ready for the wedding. And I went to Walmart to pick up some things that we needed. And as I was leaving the store, I hear somebody calling from behind me. And I turn around and there's this young woman running after me, and she's shouting for me. And in her hand, she has a stack of cash, and she's got my credit card that I had left back there on the counter. And that kind of shook me up because I'd never done anything like that before. But we went back to Washington State, which is where we live. And when I got back here, I went back to my work as an engineer, and we were reviewing a lot of paperwork associated with computer software for the work that we did. And I was on a team, and I noticed that some of the people on the team were finding things that I wasn't seeing. And that kind of surprised me because I was always good at finding that kind of stuff. So I went back to the neurologist and I told him what was going on. And he gave me this little short test. It took about 10 or 15 minutes. It's called the mini mental status exam. And one of the things that was in the test was he gave me 3 words, and he had me repeat those words. And then he had me repeat them again and again and again. And the protocol for the test, I believe, is I was supposed to repeat them 5 times, but he had me repeat them like 10 times at least. And then he had me do some other exercises, like he gave me the number 100 and he says, subtract 7 from that number. And then I came up with a number. I don't know if it was right or not, but then he said, subtract 7 from that. Now subtract 7 from that. And just keep on going down. So he had me do this mental math quiz. He had me draw some figures and copy some things. And then he asked me, okay, now tell me, what are those 3 words? And I was just amazed that I could only remember one of the words after only about two or three minutes. And they were just regular, ordinary words. And he had drilled me on them so many times. So when the test was over, he told me that he concluded that I had something called mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. And he wrote in his notes that I had early stage senile dementia, likely of the Alzheimer's type. That's how he phrased it. He didn't tell me that, but that was what he wrote in the notes. So when I went home and started looking up this mild cognitive impairment thing, I read on a website that said, well, people who are diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, 50% of them after 5 years are in complete dementia. Now, it turns out that wasn't exactly right, but that's what I read, and that really shook me up. And so I went back to the neurologist and I asked for a referral to Harborview Hospital in Seattle, where they have a very well-known, prestigious brain clinic. So I went there, and they, instead of giving me this short test, they subjected me to 3 hours of pretty intensive testing. And then they gave me another MRI. What was interesting about the MRI, and let me just back up, something I meant to say at the beginning, is between 2013 and just a month ago, or October of last year, I've had 6 MRIs of my brain. Now, when the radiologist and the neurologist look at an MRI of a brain and they're interested in a neurodegenerative disease, there are 2 things in particular they like to look at. One is the volume of the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is the part of your brain that translates short-term memory into long-term memory. So it's important to things like learning. But it also keeps you oriented in time and space, so that you know what city you're in, you know what day it is, what time it is, you know who the president of the United States is. It keeps track of that kind of stuff. It also kind of keeps a map of the floor plan of your house, so you know what room you're in. Another thing that they look at is the volume of the ventricles. The ventricles are void spaces inside the brain. And the reason they're interested in the ventricles is that as the brain atrophies, the ventricles expand in order to compensate for the loss of brain tissue. And all of our brains are undergoing some level of atrophy. It's just that under neurodegenerative diseases, the atrophy is much more rapid. So when they looked at my MRI in 2015, they told me that my hippocampus volume was at about the 33rd percentile for men my age. In other words, in a room of 100 men, 1/3 of the men below me on the scale would have larger hippocampus than mine, and 2/3 would have a bigger hippocampus than mine. So I'm kind of small. But then they also talked about the ventricles. And remember, the ventricles are telling you something about the overall atrophy of the brain. And they said my ventricles were greater than the 99th percentile for men my age. In other words, in a room of 100 men, I would be at about the 1/3 mark of volume of the hippocampus, but I would have the largest ventricles. In other words, I would have the most atrophy of my brain of all those 100 men. And this, of course, kind of shook me up, but they gave me this kind of to-do list. And they on the list were things like, you need more exercise, you need to eat a better diet, you need to, they told me, don't quit your job. And the reason you don't quit your job is you don't withdraw. You have to stay connected with people. They asked me about my sleep. Do you have sleep apnea? Yes, I do. Well, then make sure you use your CPAP machine every night. So they gave me these things to do, but I went home and I didn't exactly jump on them right away. we did go, they did have us participate in a research project by Mayo Clinic. It was called the habit study. And what the habit study did was it had an array of lifestyle interventions for Alzheimer's disease that they could test in different groups of people. So they had 7 or 8 centers across the country, and one center would do each center would do all except one, and different centers would do less than one. So there are things like diet, things like exercise, education, and computer games, things like that. So they could find out which of these things were affecting people the most. So I joined on that. My wife and I joined that. We spent a week in Seattle at a very nice place with very good food, and we participated in these activities each day for 2 weeks. Now, when we were with a neurologist at Harborview Hospital before this, they did not tell me that I had Alzheimer's disease in their report. They said, they confirmed this mild cognitive impairment. They said, you definitely have mild cognitive impairment. And they didn't write Alzheimer's disease, but when we talked, they said, that's probably what it is. And so I was going into this habit study with the understanding that I have today that I have Alzheimer's disease. I've been back to see them, by the way, annually for annual testing. They check up on me. They put me back through those same 3 hours of tests. I've had one more MRI since then. Oh no, I've had four more MRIs since then. So we participated in this study, and one of the things that we heard about was exercise. Now, at the same time, I was going to the internet and watching YouTube videos with doctors talking about Alzheimer's disease and talking about MCI. And one thing that kept coming up was the importance of physical exercise. These other things are all important that they told us about, but the most important one I kept reading and hearing was physical exercise, especially aerobic exercise. They had told me that I should be getting 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week. But the more I looked at these things online, it was more like you need 40 minutes a day, 6 days a week. So after Amy and I got back from this habit study, I went and joined the gym. And I started going there. I started getting on the treadmill every day. I went 7 days a week. I went first initially at 40 minutes a day. And after a little while, I started to feel better because I had to stop driving. If I was driving a car and I come to an intersection and I want to turn, I'd put on my turn signal, I'd start to turn, and I would have looked in the intersection to see if there was a pedestrian there. But if there was a pedestrian there, I wouldn't see the person. As I start to turn, I would finally see him and I'd slam on the brakes. And this happened to me 2 or 3 times in the space of just a couple of weeks. And so I just stopped driving. And I didn't drive for about 6 months while I began to get exercise. Now, one of the things I did when I stopped driving was I started walking to work because I was still working as an engineer. And when I would, it was about a 1 mile walk. And in the wintertime, especially, it was very refreshing walk. I enjoyed the cool air, and at least when it wasn't snowing. But it was a very pleasant walk, and I did that. And then on top of that, I started to get the aerobic exercise and started trying to do the other things. I didn't quit my job, so I stayed socially active. I resigned my position in the church. I was the executive director for the congregation. I resigned that position because it was very stressful. They wanted me to reduce my stress. But I would be walking to work every day, 5 days a week. And one day I'm coming home and there's an intersection, a very busy intersection that I have to cross to get home. And it's right near the high school. And about the time I would be walking home is when the high school is getting out. And the 16 and 17-year-olds that just got their driver's license have been driving to school, and now they're driving home. And they don't seem to understand speed limits and safe driving. And so you have to be very cautious when you cross a street that time of day, because it is a very fast street and very busy. So I remember one day I came to the intersection and I'm looking at the cars, I'm looking at the lights, and I cannot figure out what the cars are doing. I don't know when is it safe to cross. I see the red light, some lights turn red, they turn green. There's a little picture of a man on the one of the lights across the street, and sometimes he's on white and sometimes he's on red, and I don't know what that means. And finally, I see this one car come up the street, and it comes to the intersection, turns right, it goes down toward the river. And suddenly I realized the cars go on the right-hand side of the road. And as soon as I realized the cars go on the right-hand side of the road, everything made sense. I realized why the cars were stopping, when they were going, when is it safe to walk, when is it not safe to walk, and then I was able to move on. But this really shook me up because I remember to this day how incredibly baffled I was to watch those cars and not understand what's going on. So we had to go back to Harborview for the habit study a second time as a follow-up. And Amy and I are in the car. I'm not driving because I don't feel safe driving. She's driving, but we have to stop for gas. And I get out of the car to pump gas to fill a tank. And I use my credit card. I don't know in the Philippines if you've got the same kind of gas pumps, but we can use a credit card and put the credit card in. And the credit card, the gas pump is going to ask you, what is your zip code or your postal code? And it's a 5-digit number here. And we've had that code for 30 years. They changed one number on it, but we've had that same number for 40 years, and I cannot remember the number. So I go back to the car and I ask my wife, Amy, what is our zip code? And she tells me what it is. And it just does not sound familiar to me. It could be any number. I had no idea. I used that number and it worked. But then a couple of weeks later, we came home, and a couple of weeks later, I was calling somebody, and I got their answer machine, and they said, please leave a message, leave your phone number, and we'll call you back. So we've had this phone number for 30 years. And I'm trying to leave my phone number. I cannot remember what it is. So I asked my wife, what is our phone number? And she tells me what it is. And it absolutely does not sound familiar. It's like I never heard that number before. Now I left the number and they called me back, but that's not because my mind could pull it back. So these things were going on. Now on that trip to Seattle, we met a doctor, actually was a neuropsychologist, who was part of the research study, and he interviewed us, and I told him what was going on. I told him that I was getting exercise now, and I felt like things were improving. They were obviously still not better, but things seemed to me to be improving. And he told me that based on my history, he would expect me to be dead by the time I'm 75, because Alzheimer's disease is a deadly disease and it kills you in the end. And he said my life expectancy was up to the age of 75. By the way, I'm 72 right now. I'll be 73 soon enough. Okay, so now he said, if you keep doing what you're doing, because he was an expert on physical exercise and Alzheimer's disease, you keep doing what you're doing, and that is going to add 10 years. It'll be 85 before Alzheimer's will finally get you. So that's 10 years. And that's okay. 10 years, I'll buy that 10, I'll accept that 10 years. But then I got involved in another study, and this study involved the use of insulin to try to improve the uptake of glucose in the brain. And so as part of that study, I had to have 3 more MRIs. Actually, I had 2 more, and there was another study I was involved with that had another MRI. So I had a series of 3 MRIs between 2016 and 2018. Now, in those MRIs, the volume of my ventricles was always greater than the 99th percentile. So I would have the biggest ventricles of men my age out of 100 men. The hippocampus volume was now less than the 1 percentile. So I would have the smallest hippocampus, and I would have the largest ventricles, or the most atrophy, out of 100 men my age. Now, my neurologist in Seattle tells me, you know, the connection between cognition and memory and those numbers is not real solid. Just because the numbers are the way they are doesn't actually mean necessarily that you're going to have terrible cognition and terrible memory. But when I pulled those, when I Googled those numbers for volumes, I found that everybody that had those numbers is in memory care. They're in, they're not out on the street driving a car or anything like that. But I did discover that as I was getting exercise, after about 6 months, I felt like, I think I can go back to driving again. Now, I tried to go back to driving. It was clear to me very quickly that I wasn't ready. But after another month or two of just getting to the gym every day, then I tried again, and then it was pretty clear that I could drive again. And I'm driving to this day. I'm driving very safely. At the time before I quit, I knew I was having these close calls where I wouldn't see things, or I wouldn't, and I do not want to take a risk with other people's lives. So I'm very cautious. And if that was to happen again, I would quit in a minute, but it hasn't. I feel perfectly confident, and I am not having any kind of questionable events or things like that. So these things have all worked out very well for me. Let me talk here about, let me see how I can advance this. Let's see, I'm not, oh, here we go. So what was my life like before all this stuff happened? I was 65 years old when they diagnosed me. We'd been married for 34 years. We had 3 grown sons. They were all working in Seattle. Seattle's about 200 miles from where we live. It's about a 4-hour drive for us through the mountains, through the mountain pass. I retired in 2005 from the federal government after 34 years as an engineer with them. And then I worked to earn my certificate to teach physics and biology to high school students while I was doing engineering consulting. And I enjoy photography. I was really enjoying that a lot. And basically life was really, really good until this all of a sudden happened to me. And you can understand how this would have really been a shock. But at the same time, the more I studied about it, the more I learned about it, the more people I talked to, and I had an opportunity to talk to researchers, to doctors, neurologists, quite a few of them. And I got to read a lot, and I learned a lot, and found out that if I just keep, like that one doctor told me, if I just keep doing what I'm doing, I can really get a lot better. So as part of this study, insulin study, they would give me cognitive tests every 3 months. So for 18 months, I was taking these cognitive tests. And starting in 2016, then they would, each time I took the test, I would do a little bit better. And I'd do a little bit better. The next 3 months later, I'd do a little bit better. And it was very clear to me that the things I was doing was actually improving my memory and improving my cognition. Now, one of the things about going to the gym and being on the treadmill, and eventually, and I'll explain a little bit why I'm now doing 50 to 55 minutes a day instead of 20. You got a lot of time during the day to do some study. So I take my tablet with me, and I get internet connectivity in the gym, and I can watch YouTube videos. So I just started watching lots and lots of YouTube videos. A lot of them were classroom presentations by professors of neurology in medical schools, and TED Talks and things like that from different experts, people who knew what they were talking about. So I got to learn a lot about the Alzheimer's disease, about how it works, what we understand about it, and I say how it works. We don't understand as much as we'd like to know about how it works. But I learned a lot, and I learned more and more about how the reasons why these lifestyle things are so helpful. Record here, these are the things that I told you already. So I stopped working in 2016 because I really wasn't doing that well as an engineer anymore. And I was, before these things started to kick in, I was losing this sense of joy in my life. I felt isolated. I would sit on the sofa and I'd stare into space. I was losing drive. I was losing ambition. I was losing the desire to socialize. And I think it's, first off, being told, don't let this happen to you was helpful. But also, I think the getting that physical exercise also helped a lot to restore my drive, my ambition, to restore my desire to socialize. I had responsibilities in the church, even though I wasn't the executive director anymore. There were still important things I had to do. And so this was kind of the bottom. The bottom was probably the first quarter of 2016. And then I steadily improved after that. And then also, of course, what's come back is this joy has been restored to my life that I was losing. So I was scared to death. I studied and learned, like I just told you. I had great opportunities to talk to researchers and neurologists and learn what they had to say, finding out there are a lot of opinions out there about all kinds of stuff. We'd like to think we know a lot about the disease, but the more you study, the more you realize we're still learning and there's still need for a lot of research. And one of the things that I learned about was this, what we call a multi-domain strategy. And I put a lot of emphasis at the beginning on the physical exercise, but other things like diet and sleep and social connectivity are really, really also important. They all work together. So it's important to, if you want to prevent getting Alzheimer's, or if you have MCI due to Alzheimer's, then you want to embrace all of the domains in this multi-domain strategy. So today I drive safely. Now I wrote a book about my experience. In fact, I'm right now in the process of I got a Spanish version of the book. I'm still working on the translation for it with help, not by myself, but with help from others. But I did write this book. I've sold about, between the first edition, the second edition, more than 5,000 copies, explaining my experience, but also explaining the science behind why these things have all worked for me. So today I drive safely. I wrote this book. I'm an elder in my church. I work at the local food bank. I've been working there for 5 years now. I go in every Monday morning, and it can be a challenge sometimes because I work outdoors to load food and that sort of thing in the warehouse. And it was 6 degrees below zero on New Year's Day, and I had to work like the next day. And in the summertime around here, it can be 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But today I perform well on cognitive tests. My test scores right now are probably consistent with a normal person my age, and I continue to enjoy life. I wrote this book. This first edition sold about 2,500 copies, and as of yesterday, I'd sold 3,700 copies of the new book, which published in 2020. And I do have, you see, I have a co-author, Vaishali Phatak. She's a professor of neuropsychology at the University of Nebraska Medical School. So about Alzheimer's disease, what the kinds of things I've learned is what I want to share with you. I've told you my experience. I've told you that it goes kind of up and down for me nowadays. I'll go through months where I'll feel like I'm kind of losing ground. I'll go through another couple of months where I just feel like I totally bounce back, and which is consistent with what they measure when they test me. But people ask me, so I talk about this stuff, and then people ask me a question all the time. What's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? And that's a good question, because in the past, up until 2011, those two words were pretty much used interchangeably, and they still are in popular culture. People kind of use the words interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. First off, it's important to understand that dementia and MCI, which I mentioned before, mild cognitive impairment, are both syndromes. They're umbrella terms. And what they do is they describe a loss of memory, perhaps a loss of several things. And I'll get to what all those things might be in a few minutes. But it describes the effect. Alzheimer's disease is just one cause, but it's the most common cause. There are other causes. There's a frontal temporal dementia. There's a dementia with Lewy bodies. My dad had dementia. There was an autopsy on his brain after he died, and they did not find evidence of Alzheimer's disease. And I'll talk about what that evidence would have been in a few minutes. They did not find evidence of that. They did find that he had undiagnosed hydrocephalus, which is also a cause of dementia and MCI. So some of these dementias, these causes can be treated, and others cannot, or others can be treated only through lifestyle changes. For example, a lot of vegetarians don't get enough vitamin B12, and if you don't get enough vitamin B12, that can cause MCI and dementia. But if you start taking vitamin B12 supplements, then you can be restored. Unfortunately, when it gets to Alzheimer's disease, there is no drug or supplement that will cure Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of supplement peddlers on the internet trying to sell you stuff. There's this new drug called Adhoban. It's not a drug, it's a monoclonal antibody treatment that's gotten a lot of press, but it's not a cure. If it works, and that's not real clear at the moment, even though they want to charge a lot of money for it. If it works, it doesn't do much other than slow the progress of the disease. So there's not a cure, and it's not real clear what the cure would be going forward. But this multi-domain approach will, and the drugs like Aricept will treat the symptoms. And the lifestyle changes, as I've shown, will actually slow the progress of the disease. Okay, so this is new treatment called Adhoban, and I actually auditioned for the drug trial for the drug company when they were trying to test it, and I didn't make the cut, but I do know people that did participate in it. The results of the study were very ambiguous. And there was a lot of pressure on our government to approve the drug, even though the drug company was having a very hard time proving that it actually worked. But it's out there now, and some people are taking it, and it may help with people's memory, but it's not real clear if that really helps everybody. And the drug company is still on the hook to prove that it works, even though it's been approved for use. It's been approved for a conditional use. Now, another thing that's important to understand is the difference between normal aging and disease, because all of our brains are atrophying. They all are. This is part of life. And if you're 55 years or older and you're normal, you're going to worry that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease, and things are going to start happening to you that are going to make you think that maybe you're getting it. So people will have trouble remembering names. They'll have trouble remembering words they use all the time, and this can be very disturbing, but it's not necessarily abnormal. It's not. And one of the ways to kind of at least assess this is if you're having trouble remembering a word or a name, then it comes back to you later, very likely that's not an indication of disease. It could be, but very likely it's just normal. Now, you'll remember my experience. I couldn't remember my phone number or my zip code, and then my wife tells me what they are, and they don't sound familiar to me. Now that's evidence of disease. So I think there's some things that are helpful to understand about Alzheimer's disease and about how it progresses. So until recently, if someone was developing dementia, we didn't really call it Alzheimer's disease until they actually displayed evidence of actual dementia. But in reality, what we've discovered is the disease has been at work for 15 to 20 years before the first symptoms appear. I would say on average 15 years before the first symptoms, and then 20 years before dementia. And nobody knows anything's wrong. And of course, we're right now looking for tests, especially blood tests, that might show that the disease is developing. But nevertheless, it's been at work doing its damage for a long time before the first symptoms appear. When you start having trouble with memory and cognition, we call that mild cognitive impairment. And again, there can be other causes. There may be as many as 30 different causes of both MCI and dementia. It's just that Alzheimer's is the most common. It can be caused by drugs you're taking. It could be caused by vitamin deficiency. There are others. It can be caused by Parkinson's disease is another cause. Some of these are reversible and some are not. But Alzheimer's is 60 to 80% of, in the United States at least, 60 to 80% of the cases of dementia are Alzheimer's disease. So here's how it progresses. There's 3 blocks here. I'm showing here 3 stages. And you could call this 5 stages because that 3rd block can be divided up into 3 parts. And we'll talk about that in a second here. The first step is the preclinical Alzheimer's disease. That's the 15 years when nobody knows there's anything wrong. It's just working silently in the background, building up momentum until one day, all of a sudden, it hits a tipping point where all of a sudden the person realizes that they're having trouble with memory and they're having trouble with cognition. They may be getting lost. All these things start going wrong. And we call that MCI due to Alzheimer's disease. It could be due to other things, like I said before. It could be due to Parkinson's disease or something else. But when it's caused by Alzheimer's disease, we call it MCI due to Alzheimer's disease. Nominally, that might last about 5 years. Then it moves into Alzheimer's dementia. Okay, so the question is, what's the difference between MCI and dementia? Why do we suddenly call it dementia? And the concept here is that when a person gets to the point where they're no longer able to do everything they need to do to care for themselves in their daily activities, where there's something they have to do that they need help with because of the disease, then we call that dementia. Because before that, like me, they may well be able to drive a car, hold a job. They're just having trouble with memory. They may get lost sometimes, but then they get found. They find their way, those kinds of things. But once the person cannot live alone, then we call it dementia. Now, I said before, we can divide that dementia up into three more parts. And so some people would say this is 5 stages, and these are the last 3 stages. The first stage of dementia is the mild stage, and it's really, you can function almost normally. It's like MCI, except it's advanced to the point where you can't maybe do something that you need to do. But then there's the moderate stage, and this is when things start to get nasty. It's the longest stage. There are personality changes, there are behavioral changes. People can become very suspicious. Some become angry. They get frustrated. They don't know why people are hiding the car keys from them. They think that their caregiver stole their wallet. And there are more and more daily tasks that they cannot do for themselves. The severe stage is the terminal stage. And remember, Alzheimer's is a terminal disease. Once it begins, if there's not the way things are today, once it begins, it will take you all the way to the end, and then it will kill you in the end. And so in the severe stage, the person is bedridden. There's significant physical deterioration, and they're vulnerable to disease. One of the things that goes wrong at this stage is you lose the ability to swallow, to control your swallowing mechanism. And so people will sometimes breathe their food into their lungs, and that gives them what we call aspirational pneumonia. So often on the death certificate, someone will be said to have died from pneumonia, when in reality they died from Alzheimer's disease, depending on how you want to look at it. Now, here's a comparison of 2 brains. One is a healthy brain, and the other one has Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so here is the hippocampus that I talked about before. Again, this is the center that takes short-term memory and turns it into long-term memory. So it's where your learning occurs. And it also tells you what day today is, where you are, you're home or you're not home or whatever. And then there are these ventricles. And these are the lateral ventricles. There are more than just the lateral ventricles, but these are big ones. And these are the ones, if you look down here in a diseased brain, the ventricles have gotten much larger. Here is another set of ventricles. This is the lateral ventricles. This is another set of ventricles that they are expanding. And they're expanding to compensate for the fact that you're losing brain tissue in the rest of the brain. Now, what's going on that's causing you to lose all those brain cells? What's killing the brain cells? One of them is what's called amyloid plaques. And amyloids are they're not exactly, they were supposed to be protein, but they got kind of mangled, and they're what we call a peptide that is sticky. And so if you have a normal brain cell like this, it looks like that, but over here you see these amyloids are now floating loose in the brain, in the cerebrospinal fluid and all, and they're getting stuck to these neurons. And it'll get stuck there, and it'll attract another one, it'll stick to it. And these apparently, and there's some debate about what's going on here, but apparently these plaques can kill the cell, and they can also interfere with the ability of the different cells to exchange information, pass information back and forth. So these amyloids, and at this point in time, most of the research in trying to cure Alzheimer's disease is try to stop these plaques from forming. Now, the problem with some of these new medications is we found we can get rid of these, we can clean the brain of these plaques, but then people don't get better. And it doesn't seem to necessarily be stopping the disease. There's conflicting research results on that, but it's not real clear. But right now, there are two things that they're going to look for in your autopsy, for example. On my dad's autopsy, they looked for these amyloid plaques. They also looked for what's called tangles. Now, also in the brain are these microtubules. These microtubules are, they've inside all the cells in your body, except maybe red blood cells, they form kind of a skeleton that gives the cell its shape. Here that you see the microtubule going all the way through the dendrite, but also it's making a skeleton inside the cell, and it's in many of the cells of your body. And they also serve as a pathway to move nutrients around within the cell. So if part of the cell needs a certain nutrient, that nutrient might well come by way of a conveyor belt, almost a conveyor belt that these microtubules do. These microtubules are held together by a protein called tau. And there are certain varieties of this tau protein that appear in Alzheimer's disease that lose its strength. And when it loses its strength, these kind of skeletons that give the cell its shape collapse into what we call a tangle. And so you see these tangles here in this picture. So the microtubules are collapsing due to the fact they have this very weak tau protein. And these tangles now, and in addition to the amyloids that are floating around in the cerebrospinal fluid, are actually garbage inside the brain that are helping to propagate and extend and accelerate the disease process. So the hope is that you could get rid of the tangles and get rid of the amyloids, and hopefully you'd get better, but that's not real clear at this point. MCI due to Alzheimer's is where I am, and it's where something can be done. This is where these lifestyle changes will have the greatest effect, is during MCI. And I saw some research. I said I'm 72 years old, and some of these things I do can be physically demanding. So the older you are, the harder you're going to have with it. But on the other hand, some of the research I've seen says that age 75 is the peak when these changes are most effective, will do the most good. They'll do good for you when you're a teenager. They'll do good for you when you're 60 years old. But the greatest improvement apparently is at the age of 75. But everyone's different. And these diseases this disease especially will unfold differently in different people. Now, here are 4 different syndromes that are seen in Alzheimer's disease. And eventually they'll probably appear in everyone that has it, but they're going to appear in different order with different people. Now, the first is called the memory syndrome. And this is the one we immediately think about. People can't remember who they are, can't remember where they live. That is memory syndrome. And it's what, I was obviously having issues with memory syndrome myself. And it's the most common, it's the one we think of. But also, in my experience, is this visual syndrome. And what's happening, you see, in the memory syndrome, the thing that's being attacked by the disease is your hippocampus more than anything else. It's expanding out, but that's what's happening first. But then it's also attacking what's called the occipital lobe of your brain, in the back of your head, where the optic nerve from the eyes plug into your brain. And so what's supposed to happen there is what's coming in from the eye is supposed to form images in your mind so that you can see somebody walking across the street, you can see them. But when this is impaired, it's called Benson syndrome, and it's caused by the disease attacking the back of your brain. There's another thing called the language syndrome, or the logopenic variant. And this is where you have problem with word finding. And we talked about that a little bit ago. And it's normal, of course, for people to, as they get 65 years and older, to have trouble with certain words, but sometimes it gets really bad. In fact, oftentimes people will not realize, if you meet somebody who is in serious dementia, that middle stage, say in a memory care facility, they will talk gibberish. They'll talk what we call it word salad. And they will talk to you with this word salad, and they will think that they're having an intelligent conversation with you. They won't realize that they're talking gibberish. And apparently what's going on here is they're looking for certain words, they don't find the words, and they substitute other words for the words that they want. And often, apparently, the word that they substitute starts with the same letter as the word they want to say, but it's not the same word, and it's not the same meaning, and their sentences have no meaning. Now, you Bible scholars might see something here. This word logopenic, if in the Gospel of John, it begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And that word that we see in the English translation, at least of John, has been translated from the Greek, and the Greek word that's been translated as logos. You may have heard that before. So you can see that word logos has made its way into this vocabulary here. There's also something called the frontal executive syndrome, and this is the deterioration of executive function. Now, this normally will occur later, and this is probably going to cause, we said a minute ago that people can become very nasty. They become very suspicious. They can't plan their day. They can't figure out what they're doing. That has to do with attack on the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is right up here behind your forehead up here. That's what's under attack, is this the prefrontal cortex. And these are the four ways of understanding how Alzheimer's disease is asserting itself as it progresses. So what worked for me, as I said before, I did a lot of research, and a lot of the research I did was just on the treadmill, watching all these YouTube videos and TED Talks, and listening to some of the top experts in the world on Alzheimer's disease talk about what we understand about the disease. And over the period of these 7 years or so, I have been amazed at how our understanding of the disease has changed, how we are still learning a lot, and we didn't realize all the stuff we did not know even just a few years ago. And we are learning more and more and more, but the more we learn, the more we know we don't know, which is one of the challenges for science right now. But I did find this array of lifestyle changes that said could be effective, and I applied them, and it's amazing to just be able to wake up in the morning and be able to know remember what happened yesterday, know what's on the agenda for today, know what day today is, know where I am, and remember back to how it was in 2015. And I'm just so thankful to the Lord for having helped me find my way to this. And it's been transformational in my life, to my ability to relate to people. I have a mission in life. I'm not an engineer anymore, but I have a mission in life. Something important to do is to get my message out. People, ask me all the time, oh, your doctors must be really amazed at what's happened with you. And I say, yes, they are amazed. And you know what they're amazed about? They're amazed that somebody actually did what they told them to do. Because that's what I'm doing. I'm doing what they told me to do, and it actually works. Now, the lifestyle changes that I did fall into these domains. And the domains are the thing I would want to emphasize. While each one is important in its own right, and exercises clearly stand out as the most valuable, they all work together. So the first domain is exercise, and it's aerobic exercise. It's not lifting weights, but it's getting on the treadmill. Now, lifting weights and doing weights exercise is important because it helps you strengthen the muscles you need to not fall down. And older people have a tendency to fall and get hurt, and that's really bad. So working out with weights is a good thing, but the most important thing to do is get on the treadmill or walk around the block, anything. Now, I'll tell you in a minute how I landed on this 50 minutes a day, 6 days a week, and how fast you have to go. You have to you should work up a sweat in 10 minutes or have trouble talking after 10 minutes. Or your heart rate should come up to 65% of the maximum for your age. So how do you calculate that? You start with a number 220, you subtract your age and multiply it by 0.65. So for me, that ends up with being a number of about 96 beats per minute. So by 10 minutes, and the treadmill I use, gives me my heart rate. But I also have what's called a pulse oximeter. I don't know how many people know what that is, but it's something you can fit on your finger. It'll tell you your pulse, it'll tell you your oxygen. And you can use that to tell, if you're just out walking around the block or whatever you're doing, you can use that to tell your heart rate. And so I looked for trying to get above, and I can get there pretty quickly to above 65% of my heart rate, which is a little bit less than 100 beats per minute, although I usually work my way up to about 130 beats per minute. You don't exceed your maximum. For me, the maximum is 148. So I don't exceed that, but I will get up to about 130 for myself at my age. Do you really need to do that? How much do you need to do? And some studies of just studying people who work in the garden can find measurable increases in their brain volume after a year. Not much, but enough. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean their cognition, memory improve, but it does show that you're rebuilding brain tissue. And I'll explain how that happens in a minute. And again, my neurologist is always warning me, don't make too strong a connection between brain volume and these things and cognition and memory, although clearly there is a connection. So why is exercise important? And the first thing people think of, well, it must improve the circulation of blood to the brain. And I'm sure that's a factor. But it also, when you're doing extended exercise, and which is why aerobic exercise, you keep going, you don't take breaks, you keep going, your body generates this protein called the brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a special protein that supports the survival of brain cells. One of the things that it does, there are stem cells in your hippocampus, and it can prompt those stem cells to form new neurons. So it's this action, apparently it's this action of this protein that you generate during physical exercise that can cause you to increase the volume of your brain. So it's according to the Wikipedia, it's active in the hippocampus, the cortex, the basal forebrain, areas vital to learning, memory, and higher thinking. Now, you can get this. The best way to get this is through exercise. Another way to get it is through fasting, actually intermittent fasting. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so here's one study that caught my attention, and it was a study of women who walk. They studied 6,000 women over a period of 6 to 8 years, and they said how much did they walk, and how much exercise did they get? And the women here, and then they measured their cognition and how much decline they had. how many experienced decline. And the people that got the most exercise right over here, they experienced the least decline. The women who didn't walk at all or didn't walk very much, they experienced the most decline. Now, here's another important study. They did this with people that were younger. They had a special kind of Alzheimer's disease that's called young onset Alzheimer's disease that gets to you when you're in your 40s or 50s. And it's devastating. It's very much correlated with your genetics. So it's easy to predict when somebody's going to get it. But they plotted people's test scores, cognitive test scores, against how much exercise they got. And you can see here, at this point here, these are the normal people up here that didn't do that, that had the same amounts of exercise. And more exercise, more exercise, more exercise. And you see, they don't change with exercise. But the people with Alzheimer's, it does change. And right here is the maximum. Notice here, if you exercise too much, you start losing ground. So don't exercise too much. But right here is about, this is about 50 to 55 minutes a day to an hour a day for 6 days a week is right there. That's the sweet spot. And that's what I target. Now, the next is diet. There's a diet called the MIND diet. It's similar to the Mediterranean diet, if you've heard of that before. That's a very popular diet for people who are concerned about their health. It stays away from red meat, stays away from butter and margarine and cheese. It emphasizes vegetables, emphasizes fish and poultry, no red meat, no pork, no. It also emphasizes no pork and no beef. It also emphasizes blueberries and strawberries for their, and tree nuts for their antioxidant effects. Whole grain bread, beans, again, no stick butter, margarine, cheese, moderate red wine. I don't drink, so that's not part of it. There are two other diets that are important. One's called the Mediterranean diet, the other is the DASH diet. Those are good too, but this one is being studied very carefully as it may have a very powerful effect on Alzheimer's disease, and you can read about it on the internet. So here are the kinds of foods that I eat: fish, spinach, avocado, blueberries, tree nuts. Up in the left-hand corner, there's chocolate. Now that's not milk chocolate. That's not a Hershey candy bar. It's not a Snickers bar, but that is your bittersweet chocolate that maybe is 70% cacao that you for baking, that kind of chocolate. That in moderation, that's positive for brain health. And there are two things you want to do, and I think I've gone over time already. But there are two things you're trying to accomplish with your diet. One is to reduce inflammation. So inflammation is part of the progress of Alzheimer's disease. So you don't want to eat foods that aggravate inflammation. Those include refined sugar and flour. I don't know how much McDonald's you have in the Philippines, but McDonald's is really bad for Alzheimer's disease. Also, there are these omega-3 fatty acids that are in fish and olive oil. They fight inflammation. However, fish oil supplements do not seem to help by all the research. Eating fish helps. Taking fish oil supplements does not appear to help by all the research that I've seen. So you want to fight oxidation. Oxidation is a process that occurs inside the cells that kills the cells, and it's part of the progress of Alzheimer's disease. So we eat foods that fight oxidation. Those include blueberries, strawberries, olive oil, and some other things. Unfortunately, supplements are not a big help, so save your money. There are supplements that might help other causes of dementia and other causes of MCI, but for Alzheimer's disease, it's not very helpful. And again, fish oil has been studied very extensively. Eating fish is good, but taking fish oil supplements as a substitute, not so much. However, I would say I have seen some interesting research in progress on some of these, on some supplements. So that may change in the future, but right now, there are people eagerly trying to sell supplements to help you with your memory and cognition, but they may not work. They're not for Alzheimer's disease. Sleep is very important. Right behind exercise is probably more important than diet. Because when you sleep, when you go into what's called deep sleep, the brain cells actually shrink. And that changes the volume of the cerebrospinal fluid around the cells. And when you change that, and that fluid volume expands by about 60% while you're in deep sleep. And that's causing circulation of the fluid. Also, your brain waves slow way down to maybe 4 times a second. And those pulsing brain waves are also pulsing the blood flow through the brain. And that's also causing additional circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. And that's sweeping out these tangles that we talked about before. It's sweeping out the amyloids that are floating free, and it takes them out to the boundary of the brain where there's an interface with the lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system can get rid of all the trash in your brain. So you need deep sleep to get rid of the trash, because that trash will, if it accumulates, it's going to increase the ability of the disease to progress. And so you want to get rid of that trash. Getting rid of that trash requires deep sleep. And with older people, we have a harder and harder time sleeping. There's a center, I've been reading this book by this guy from Berkeley, a professor from Berkeley, and he says the center for sleep is a spot right behind your, right behind here in your head, and that atrophies and it makes it harder to sleep. Old people need just as much sleep as young people, but we have a harder and harder time because of the atrophy of that part of the brain. Now, now Alzheimer's disease accelerates atrophy of the brain. So when this thing happens, it interferes with their sleep, it interferes with the atrophy of brain, and it makes your sleep even worse. So if you talk to people who work in memory care facilities, people with Alzheimer's disease are up all night walking the halls. That's part of the disease, is this, you can't sleep, but sleep is so important, and try to deal with it. Other domains, social connection. So I keep working my food. I work at the food bank. I keep working in my church. I have photography as a hobby, and I work with other photographers. So I stay socially connected. Reduce stress. Reduce my commitments. Meditation. Now, a lot of times when we think of meditation, we think of Eastern religions from India and places like that, because they're making and they're making the lotus position. But there is also Christian meditation. Now, so when the Bible talks about meditation, a lot of times it's talking about reflecting on God's law and the things that he has for you. But what I do is I have some chants from the Catholic Church that I find very soothing. And I just continue to listen to those, and I find that very helpful. But this idea of having quiet time, I have a bad insomnia. Every night I will wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'll be up for an hour and a half. And that's the time I choose to read my Bible. I choose that, and I spend time in prayer. So I use that time for Bible reading and prayer. And then when I'm done with that, I seem to be able to, usually like last night, be able to easily get back to sleep, even when I absolutely could not sleep before that. The other thing is learn new things. And I've been continuing to learn Spanish. I'm not able to learn new words anymore. But I am able to stay able to carry on a conversation with friends in Ecuador and Mexico. Now, there's research on whether Sudoku and crossword puzzles help. Maybe, maybe not. The research, the one researcher I read about said he was asked, he was doing research on physical exercise, and people asked him, well, does Sudoku and crossword puzzles, will those help people fight Alzheimer's disease? And he said, people should just put down their crossword puzzles and go to the gym. And the research is that you can get better and better at crossword puzzles. You can get better and better at Sudoku, but it's not real clear that does anything outside of making you better at those. Now, that being said, especially if you go back to your teen years and your early and your 20s, things that you exercise your brain with back then can apparently provide a protective effect against Alzheimer's disease. I was participating in a conference on Alzheimer's disease by the Alzheimer's Association 2 years ago, and there was research presented about when do these lifestyle changes when is it most critical from the standpoint of preventing disease? It turns out it's in your 20s and teens. And now tell a teenager that you got to eat right, you got to get exercise, you got to study your foreign language so you don't get Alzheimer's disease when you're 70, and just see how much luck you have with that one. So unfortunately, that's the way that works. But learning is really important, especially apparently learning a foreign language, and especially if you learn it when you're younger. And I think in the Philippines, you folks all have to learn more than one language just to get by. So that's a good thing for you. Another thing that I learned is about fasting. First off, you really should be doing a 12-hour fast from the time you, regardless of whether you're worried about Alzheimer's or not, from the time you finish your dinner until you have your breakfast, you really should allow for 12 hours. And that's to allow your brain to adjust for the amount of glucose you have in your body. When there's too much glucose all the time, you're bombarding your system with glucose, it's going to generate lots and lots of insulin, and your system for, especially in the brain, for metabolizing glucose and energy is going to deteriorate, and that's what leads to diabetes, which is a major factor in Alzheimer's disease. People who get diabetes are very vulnerable to Alzheimer's disease. Lately, for the last 2 years now, I've been doing a 20-hour fast a day. Now, I'm not suggesting this for you, okay, but this is the level of fasting that will actually help generate that, from what I read, will help generate this neurotrophic factor, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So I have only a 4-hour eating window to eat in. It was kind of a challenge at first, but after I got used to it, it seemed to work for me. I'm not saying it works for everybody, but I certainly would like to think it's contributed to my last set of tests that they gave me where I did really well. So question, am I cured? The answer is absolutely not. This disease is a deadly disease. It will follow me to the end if I don't get run over by a car, or, it's what will kill me. But what I'm told is these things have bought me 10 years. In other words, based on where I was in 2015, I should be dead here in just a couple years. And at this point in time, I should be almost bedridden. But I'm not. And in fact, I'm happy to be here with you and sharing my experience, getting my book out there, which I hope, I'm told, I've sold many thousands of copies now, and I get a lot of feedback from people who tell me it's helped them. So this is my mission in life right now, and basically it's why I'm able to say that this has been a blessing to me in a way, in many ways. And a couple facts and figures. I just want to, from this, I would just give you one thing to keep in mind, and that is that in the United States, at least, it's the 6th leading cause of death in the United States, Alzheimer's disease. In the state of Washington, where Dr. Jimmy and I live, it's the 3rd leading cause of death. Now, it's kind of a good thing because it means we're not dying from other stuff and we're living longer. So in a sense, it's a good thing, but we have to remember that it is a deadly disease. And how are things going on in research? I think I've covered that. There's some drug trials going on. They are really pouring in the money and the experiments and the research, and they keep on hitting dead ends. But there's always every time something doesn't go the way you'd hope, it really points an arrow in the direction of something where there might be some hope. So we're really learning more and more about the disease. One of the things that we're learning is how really complicated this disease is. So what are the risk factors? Age is important. People over 85 or 32% of people over 85 will have Alzheimer's disease. Women are at greater risk, although they carry it a lot more gracefully than men. The men are more likely to get nasty and abusive while they have it, and women less so. There's this gene, APOE4 gene, and I don't know if people in the Philippines have 23andMe test their DNA, but what they'll do is they'll look for this gene, because this gene, it doesn't guarantee that you'll get Alzheimer's disease, but it's a risk factor. So I do not have this gene, and so I don't know why I have it. But although, as I said a minute ago, when I was a teenager and when I was in my 20s, I lived at McDonald's and Burger King, and that well may be where I got started. Family history. Now, that's not just genetic, because in a family, maybe everybody smokes cigarettes. Maybe everybody has bad diet. Maybe everybody is overweight. So there can be a family correlation, but that's not necessarily genetic. Also, if you have cardiovascular issues, blood pressure, that's bad for the brain if you have high blood pressure, and that can apparently correlate with Alzheimer's disease. Smoking, diabetes, obesity, poor diet, lack of exercise. As I said before, education can be very important. People who are well educated in their teens and 20s are much less likely to have Alzheimer's in their old age. Social isolation is very important. There's a strong correlation with hearing loss and Alzheimer's disease. And apparently the reason for that correlation is that people with hearing loss start having trouble speaking with other people and understanding them, and they become socially isolated. And this is a big risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Another is head injury. Apparently, and these are all things that are being studied. Apparently, a head injury, especially later in life, can trigger Alzheimer's disease. It can certainly trigger all kinds of dementia. There's no question about that. Maybe including Alzheimer's disease. Also, I was diagnosed with glaucoma within months of when I was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And apparently that's pretty common. And why they're connected, I have no idea. I also take tamsulosin, like many men, for prostate. There's been a statistical correlation with that drug with Alzheimer's disease, so who knows? Anyway, I went over time. My wife gave me a little note here a minute ago, says I was way late. But I do want to make sure that anybody has questions, they can ask me. And I think that Dr. Jimmy is going to make sure that the recording is available to people. So I open the floor up to questions.
Yeah, and this will be recorded. I'll send it to Banji, and you can email me for what you can do. You can send me or send to Banji your emails, and we'll send it to you once I download the recording. So please send in quickly your email. Before that, Dr. Washington, you want to give some comment before the questions?
Okay, I think I call David professor because he is a professor. He's put a lot of time into covering this and simplifying it so that everybody can understand how they can help themselves to deal with this problem. Unfortunately, having dealt with patients who have this problem, I have to agree with what he says. The treatments that are available today are ineffective in helping the patients. They may slow down the disease some, but the best treatment obviously is for people to change their behavior, their diet, to exercise, and to make sure they deal with known medical problems effectively, like diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, elevated cholesterol. Those things have to be dealt with. You have to be careful when you take medications, because a lot of medicines that you get when you're older can increase memory loss and cause people to have difficulty with memory. And that's an important consideration when you see someone who's having more difficulty with memory. What medicines are they taking, and what are the side effects of those medicines? I think that's another significant factor. But there's not a lot I can add that Professor Brown hasn't provided for you. I highly recommend getting a copy of his book, which is very well written and simplifies most of the knowledge that we have about dementia. So that's the summary that I can give. If there are questions for me, I'll be happy to try to answer those questions. But I think we've covered practically everything you should know, and you got firsthand knowledge from someone who has had actual experience with disease, as opposed to those of us who listen and try to help people.
Yeah, I think there's a question, Dave, on MCT oil, the coconut derived oil, whether it helps. It's touted to help improve memory, the MCT oil.
Yeah, I don't believe it, frankly. I haven't seen any rigorous scientific. I rely on peer-reviewed research. I have seen some research trying to demonstrate something there, but I haven't seen anything that I would hang my hat on. One of the things that I mentioned in my book, and that is kind of the psychology of how we deal with disease. We want to find a pill that we can take that'll cure us. Maybe a pill, maybe some elixir or something like that that we can drink or something like that. And that becomes, you know, if I have a headache, I'll take an ibuprofen. If I have a, you know, sickness, the doctor might prescribe me an antibiotic. And we look for pop a pill or take something like that. And I don't think that that's part of our psychology, the way we think about this stuff. So I think I become very skeptical when we start talking about supplements, because I'm afraid they become a substitute for doing the hard stuff.
Well, I can comment on that also. I agree with what you just said. There are no objective studies that show that coconut oil does anything. Any drug that gets used has to undergo a double-blind placebo control process before it gets approved for use. And a lot of anecdotal recommendations for treatment of things have not been tested. And by that, I mean, if you give the same thing to 100 people and 75 people get better on it, then it probably is effective for that particular problem. But if 30 people get better on it, that's actually a placebo effect, which means that they feel that they got better, but when you really follow them, you find out that they didn't get any better. So that's the difference between some of the over-the-counter recommended products. They have not had significant scrutiny to determine if they are consistently effective for everyone who takes them. And even the drugs that have had that scrutiny don't work that well.
And I appreciate all the kind words that people have for me here. Okay, by the way, if you go looking for my book on Amazon, make sure you buy the second edition, not the first edition, because apparently you can buy some used copies of that one. And I've had some people who were very disappointed. They didn't realize they were buying a used copy of the first edition rather than a new copy of the current edition. The current edition is much better than the first edition. Well, does this mean that between Dr. Washington and I, we explained Alzheimer's disease so perfectly that, that no one has a single question?
Yeah. Okay, so Banji, anything else?
Thank you very much, Elder Dave Brown, for your very informative message. And many people texting me saying that they're so happy to attend this webinar. And also thank you, Dr. Clarence Washington, for sharing with us your experience,
Thank you.
For
sharing with us. Thank you.
So we'll keep you posted, everyone. And if we want other topics, we'll try to arrange it in the future.
May I suggest that you go to Amazon and then buy the book, Beating the Dementia Monster.
Yeah, I think there's a Kindle edition. Is there a Kindle edition, Dave Brown?
Yes, there is a Kindle edition. So it's the Kindle edition is about $5, a little less than $5.
Yeah, so you can just download it to your iPad. It'd be easier rather than getting a hard book because it's hard to reach the Philippines, the books.
Yeah.
Yeah.